I hope more of us will join us. And let us begin by introducing the host of this webinar, that is NAPI, Nutrition Advocacy and Public Interest India. It had its inception in 2016, and it is a national think tank on nutrition consisting of independent experts in epidemiology, human nutrition, community nutrition, and pediatrics, medical education and administration and management, having decades of experience in respective fields. This think tank has come together to advocate on nutrition policy in public interest. So you can visit our website at www.napindia.in. That is visible, I hope, on the screens for you all. Next, I would want to introduce the next host, that is BPNI, Breastfeeding Promotion Network of India. It was founded in 1991. It is a national network of organizations and individuals dedicated to promote mother and child health through protection and promotion and support of breastfeeding. There are many works that are undertaken by BPNI, IMS Act monitoring, capacity building, advocacy, networking, WBTI assessment are among the few of them. You can visit our website at www.bpni.org to know more about us and our work, and you can also find a lot of resource material that you may use. I would like to share that Breastfeeding Promotion Network of India and Nutrition Advocacy in Public Interest is conducting this webinar, believing that guidance for consumption of ultra-processed foods becomes even more important as we continue to face this pandemic of COVID-19. So, and we have great collaborations with the University of Sao Paulo and Deakin University, Australia. So let me go further and share the agenda with you guys. We will be starting by an opening comment by the chairperson, Professor HPS Sachdev, and then our first panelist, Dr. Maria Laura Louzada, will talk about dietary patterns in Brazil and global evidence of increased consumption of UPFs on health outcomes and its mechanisms. Next, we will have Dr. Arun Gupta. He will present on identifying food according to NOVA classification and how to make a food choice to reduce consumption of ultra-processed foods. This will be followed by Dr. JP's presentation, who will talk about politics, marketing, and conflicts of interest in the science of ultra-processed foods. We will then have Dr. Philip Baker, who will soon be joining us, and he will talk about policy responses to ultra-processed foods in global context. In the end, the webinar will be summarized and some recommendations would be suggested. This will be shared by our chairperson, Professor HPS Sachdev. And we will conclude today's session with the Q&A session, which will be moderated by Dr. HPS Sachdev. And that is it. I welcome you all again. I see more and more participants joining us as swiftly. A quick announcement for our participants. We would be doing the Q&A session in the end. So please put all your questions in the Q&A box. And that would be helpful for us. And I request all our speakers to please keep to the time limits. And it will help us to achieve a successful flow of this webinar. Okay, so without any further ado, please all of us join me in welcoming the chairperson, Professor Harshpal Singh Sachdev. He is a senior consultant in pediatrics and clinical epidemiology at Sita Bhartia Institute of Science and Research, New Delhi. He is honorary senior research fellow at UCL Institute of Global Health, University College, London. He is an adjunct professor at St. John's Research Institute, Bangalore, and also practicing pediatrician. Professor Sachdev is credited with 313 indexed publications. He is involved in editing 16 books and contributed to 39 reports. He has published recently several systematic reviews, including Cochrane Review on Nutrition and Child Health, and has been an editor for the Cochrane Developmental Psychosocial and Learning Problems Group since 2008. So the screen is all yours, Dr. Harshpal Singh Sachdevji.
Thank you so much, Abhilasha, for the elaborate introduction. And I congratulate NAPI and BPNI for having a webinar in these difficult times on a very timely subject. And it is possible that this emergency or opportunity will be used as an opportunity to market these things. But no, I'm not trying to bias people. It was a few years ago that in a WHO guideline group meeting, I happened to meet Carlos Monteiro, the father of this classification, and I first became sensitized to the term ultra processed foods or the NOVA classification. For about half an hour or so, I felt, well, what's new in this? What is so great about this? It's one of the new classification, and so what's the fun? Why go about thinking about this? But slowly, as I started interacting with Carlos, I did get a sense that what he was talking was quite sensible and had an impact and was likely to have a much, much bigger impact in the times to come on global health and nutrition. The reason for that, I thought, was that we are generally tuned in a very narrow paradigm of calories, proteins, fats, micronutrients, but it is not that which we measure and consume. It is the type of foods that we measure and consume, and this was a way forward in what they had looked into the classification and created evidence around it, that what are the dietary patterns we can do, which are the ones which are likely to be good for health or bad for health. So it is in this sense we feel, quite a few of us who have engaged in depth in the nutrition activism, if you like to call it, or with its implications on health or commercial exploitation, we see that this is likely to emerge or has already emerged as a big danger in several countries. And it is topical at this time to review the evidence from colleagues around Brazil, where this classification started, and from Australia. The speaker will be joining us a little later. So without wasting any further time, I would request Abhilasha to introduce the next speaker and carry on. Thank you.
So much, Professor H.P.S. Sachdev. I can see that more people have joined us. We have, as of now, around 190 participants. So let me just do the honor of inviting our first panelist. She's Dr. Maria Laura. I request you, ma'am, to please begin sharing your screen as I introduce you. So she is a PhD in Public Health Nutrition and is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Nutrition at the School of Public Health, University of Sao Paulo, and a researcher at the Center of Epidemiological Research in Nutrition and Health, NUPEN's UPS. Her research interests broadly focus on the association between food consumption, particularly of ultra-processed foods, and chronic disease risk in nationally representative surveys. She is also a co-investigator of Nutrinet Brazil study, a web-based cohort study that will investigate risk factors for chronic diseases in 200,000 Brazilian adults during 10 years. Over to you, Dr. Maria. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Can you see my screen and listen to me? Yeah, okay. So, good morning here from Brazil. It's good evening in India, and we are like in many time zones in this webinar. I want to thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here sharing with you some ideas and also representing Professor Carlos Monteiro and our entire team from UPFs from the University of São Paulo. I will use my 15 minutes to talk a bit about background, concepts, and scientific evidence regarding ultra-processed foods and its impact on health. I want to start my presentation by sharing this graph that tells us a little bit about the background of this classification system that is called NOVA and the concept of ultra-processed food. This graph shows us the temporal changes in food purchases by the Brazilian families between 1987 and 2009. Below the horizontal line, you can see foods whose caloric share has fallen in this period, and above the horizontal line, you can see foods whose caloric share has increased in the period. So we can notice that the consumption of rice, beans, flour, eggs, milk, meats, and also oil and table sugar has fallen, while the consumption of sweet snacks, crackers, cookies, cakes and pies, sausages, ready-to-eat meals, and also sugary drinks has increased. What can we conclude by looking at this graphic? 10 years ago, when Professor Carlos and our team from the University of São Paulo first looked at this graphic, food processing was virtually ignored in studies of food consumption. And the first thing that caught our attention was the expressive following the consumption of oils and sugar. That was exactly the central recommendation at that time to curb the increase in the obesity prevalences. So at first glance, we thought it would be like a contradiction or even a paradox. But the same data gave us a clue to begin to understand that observing changes in food consumption from the perspective of nutrient content only, a perspective that was really important in the era of nutritional deficiencies, would not be sufficient anymore to understand the causes of the obesity pandemic. So observing the use, the purpose, and the nature of the foods that are here in this graphic, we're able to observe that, in fact, a radical change was taking place in the dietary patterns of the Brazilian population. And these changes were not exactly characterized by changes in the nutrient profile of the diet, but in the decrease of the consumption of the traditional meals of the Brazilian population, and that uses oils and sugar, and an increase in industrialized, ready-to-eat foods that later would be called ultra-processed foods. So we built a new hypothesis that the key elements to explain the association between food consumption and health would not be in nutrients, not even foods, but what is done to food before its acquisition and consumption by the population, that is, food processing. But obviously, it's not useful to divide food only in two groups, like unprocessed or processed foods, because almost all food is processed in some way. So it is really important to separate harmless, beneficial, or even essential processing from types of processing that are harmful for human health and the planet. And in this first type of processes, we have like three main objectives. The first is to increase the durability of food and thus to avoid food losses. 2, to optimize or shorten preparation time. And 3, to modify sensory characteristics. So in these processes transform unprocessed foods that are like here at the beginning of the system into minimally processed foods that are foods that do not receive new substances, like white rice, into processed culinary ingredients like oil, that is an extraction of a food, and also into processed foods like cheese, which receive a more sophisticated type of processing and also receive salt. These foods are consumed in isolation. They are combined with unprocessed foods or combined into each other in culinary preparations, and they are the basis of traditional diets that are consumed in centuries by many populations with a wild cultural and regional varieties. Radically different is what we call ultra processing. So ultra processing is really different from this process I've just talked about in the last slide. The objective of ultra processing is creating an entire new product. Maybe ultra processed foods could not be even called foods, they are products. And the main characteristic of ultra processed food is that they are done with parts of foods, with components of foods. And the food matrix, the intact food matrix is almost null in these foods. And they are like added and finalized with the addition of cosmetic additives that make them really palatable and attractive. We could have like many examples of ultra processed foods, and maybe like the last trend topic around ultra processed foods are the plant-based burgers. So this classification system and the concept of ultra processed food was published for the first time in 2009. And now it is like increasingly recognized by science and policy. And this year, 2020, 10 years after the first paper talking about ultra-processed foods, we have conducted a systematic review of the literature, evaluating the broad impact of ultra-processed foods on child, adolescent, and adult health. And in this review, we have found a total of 54 studies published in the literature, evaluating the relationship between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and many chronic diseases, and also direct risk factors for these diseases. The evidence is particularly consistent for obesity or indicators of obesity, whose association with the consumption of ultra-processed food was demonstrated with dose response effects in studies using nationally representative samples from 5 countries: Brazil, US, Australia, Canada, and UK. Also in 3 cohort studies, large cohort studies: ELSA study from Brazil, the Sun Project from Spain, and also UK Biobank, and in 1 randomized controlled trial conducted by the NIH from the US. In this trial, 20 adults were randomized in 2 groups. The first group received for 2 weeks a diet based only on non-ultra-processed foods, while the other group received for 2 weeks a diet with more than 80% of ultra-processed foods. And in the end of these 2 weeks, you can see the results of this study in this first graph, that the group that received the ultra-processed diet, represented by the blue line, ate on average 500 calories per day more than the group that received the non-ultra-processed diet, represented by the red line. And as expected, in the second graph, you can see that after 2 weeks, the group that received the ultra-processed diet gained on average 1 kilogram of weight, while the group that received the non-ultra-processed diet lost the same amount of weight. And it's important to highlight that these diets were paired in energy content and also many nutrient content. So they have the same amount of energy and many nutrients. Large cohort studies also have shown the association, a significant association between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer. Studies from France, Spain, and now also one from the UK Biobank that's not published yet. All results adjusted for obesity, associations that are independent of obesity. Two big studies from Spain and France also showed a significant association of the consumption of ultra-processed foods and depression. And finally, 4 big studies from Spain, France, and US showed an impact of ultra-processed foods on all-cause mortality. That is one of the most important indicators of burden of disease. Although there are many mechanisms that are not elucidated yet, there are many characteristics of ultra-processed foods that are determined by the highly processed nature of these foods that can explain its association with chronic diseases. So first, they are convenient, portable, sold as snacks, beverages, ready-to-eat dishes, and promoted by aggressive marketing. So they promote ways of eating that are associated to excessive and mindless calorie consumption, while they also replace freshly made meals based on unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Forde and collaborators in a recent study reviewed 5 studies published in the literature and described that people exposed to unprocessed diets eat in a speed that is 50% higher than people exposed to diets made of unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And they suggested that this could be also a mechanism to explain why ultra-processed foods promote higher energy intake. Large portion sizes, that is also a feature of ultra-processed foods, were already associated with higher energy intake and weight gain. Ultra-processed foods have higher energy density, more free sugar, more saturated and trans fats. They also have less dietary fiber, protein, many micronutrients, and bioactive compounds. And the overall deterioration of the nutritional dietary quality was demonstrated in nationally representative studies of 10 middle and high-income countries, showing a consistent evidence of the deterioration of diet quality of these foods. Ultra-processed foods also cause higher glycemic response and low satiety potential. The ingredients of these foods, mainly characterized by sugars, oils, and fats, added with cosmetic additives and processed with the destruction of food matrix and with the removal of water content, they damage the physiology of satiety control systems. There are many evidences that these cosmetic additives, mainly thickeners, dyes, and also non-caloric sweeteners, they also cause huge metabolic alterations and also neoplastic alterations that could cause diseases. And an increasing evidence hypothesized that part of this mechanism is linked to the damage that ultra-processed foods could cause in the intestinal microbiome. And lastly, chemical compounds related to the production or the package of ultra-processed foods could also be a potential mechanism to explain the association of these foods with health. For example, nitrosamines or acrylamide that are used in heat-treated processed foods or bisphenol A that is really common in plastic packing of these foods were already linked to increase the risk of some chronic diseases such as cardiovascular diseases and cancer. And there are now some studies that use the enhanced data bank that showed the association between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and the urinary concentration of some of these chemical compounds. So these results are even more important when we see that the consumption of these foods are growing worldwide, but with special intensity in middle and low middle income countries. So in this graphic, you can see the retail sales of ultra-processed foods in 7 world regions between 2000 and 2013. You may see that the consumption, the sales of ultra-processed foods are higher in regions like North America and Australasia that are richer regions of the world, but changes between 2000 and 2013 are higher in less rich regions, like in Latin America and Eastern Europe, and also in Asia and Pacific. So to finish here my presentation, I want to say that the NOVA classification system and the concept of ultra-processed food is increasingly recognized by science and policymakers. This concept was addressed in recommendations by the FAO, as you may see in this first publication, and also in PAHO publications, the Pan American Health Organization, and in many national dietary guidelines. Here you can see guidelines from Uruguay, Peru, Ecuador. And this approach, the guideline from Brazil was the first guide to use this approach. The central recommendation is to avoid ultra-processed foods and to prefer culinary preparations based on unprocessed and minimally processed foods. And our guide has supported many public policies in Brazil and also around the world. But about this issue, we are going to listen to other speakers, and I'm excited to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for an excellent presentation, a short, succinct summary, and for telling us that what are ultra-processed foods, and there are various grades of processing, right from unprocessed to minimally processed to ultra-processed foods, and showing us the evidence as a systematic review from several studies of their adverse effects or impact on health, particularly obesity and non-communicable diseases, a new link to cancer and depression, and more importantly to long-term all-cause mortality. And also you have deliberated upon the potential mechanisms which are cheap, easy, convenient to eat foods, which are highly bioavailable, contain a lot of sugar, salt, disrupt the food matrix, and have some potentially harmful additives also. And really the crux of the presentation for me was that the sales are increasing throughout globally. The Americas are right there at the top. The LMICs are also increasing this, but we still have a long way to go, and this is the right time to try to prevent. And Brazil has actually shown the way, not only by giving this classification, but by instituting remedies for this at a public health level. Thank you so much, Maria. We will take all the questions at the end for all the participants who are there, and you could type them in the question answer box. If you want a particular speaker to reply to them, please write it out there. Some of them may be responded to in the question answer box, while the others may be taken live. And thank you, Abhilasha. Now, can I request you to introduce the next speaker?
Thank you so much, Dr. H.P. Sachdev. I would firstly want to welcome Dr. Philip Baker. He has joined us. And although he has a presentation later on, but welcome you, sir. And let me introduce the next panelist to all of us. He's Dr. Arun Gupta, and he's a pediatrician, a fellow Indian Academy Pediatrics, who chose to give up his lucrative private practice and founded the Breastfeeding Promotion Network of India, BPNI, in 1991. He focuses on policy analysis regarding support of breastfeeding women and child nutrition and conflicts of interest. He writes nationally and internationally. He is the creator of IBFAN's World Breastfeeding Trends Initiative. He is the convener of Alliance Against Conflict of Interest, that is AKI, and our co-host Nutrition Advocacy in Public Interest India, that is NAPI, for policy level inputs. Over to you, Dr. Arun. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Abhilasha, and thank you everyone who has joined us, and welcome Phil to this. I'll just try, I'm finding difficulty in sharing the screen, but I'll try it again, try it 3 times. Let me see, can you see this? Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes, Arun.
Okay, all right. Okay, oh God, there's some technical hitch here that the slides don't move further. I don't know why. Let me try some other method. Yes. So I'll begin from here, talking about what WHO actually, prescribes about the type of diet we should eat, and what we are heading towards. And thank you, Maria, for having done the wonderful work of, putting everything to explain the type of foods which we are eating. So this is WHO advising on a healthy diet, which is both for this. I'm glad to share that this is a very key recognition that the diet for infants and young children is also considered. I mean, most of the time, this discussion is left to food which the adults or the grown-up children consume when we call diet. So I'm happy to introduce this fact that WHO's healthy diet has 2 components to it: infants and young children, which means breastfeeding for exclusively for first 6 months, continued breastfeeding for 2 years and beyond, along with good complementary feeding and avoiding of salt and sugar. WHO advises fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, whole grains, unprocessed, grains, meats, and chicken, eggs, etc., as a healthy diet for adults, along with prescribe the limits of fats and sugars, especially the trans fats and the saturated fats, and how much sugar and salt one should consume. So, the key fact which we need to note is that the WHO diet does not include ultra-processed foods because it is unhealthy. And why it is unhealthy, Dr. Maria had elaborated out very well on this. So what food industry pitches us, the whole of ultra-processed food, for the matter of convenience of our eating or in whatever way, it is actually replacing things from our kitchen, from our dining tables, to what we eat you see on the right side. These foods are being our naturally cooked real foods, or some people call it food versus formulations. All this is being, changing the culture as well as the traditions which we are into, and end result is the harm which the evidence has been, and I'm sure the next speaker will also talk about why that is happening. So it's changing the market profile of the food. The food is seen like this, not as a food, but the cans and the boxes of foods, which are mostly always or mostly ultra processed. So NOVA classification you have known. I will not go into the detail. These 4 food groups have been defined, but I'll share with you some examples picked up from India and then see which help in identifying them actually. So unprocessed or minimally processed, like we call it group 1. Processed culinary ingredients we call group 2. Processed foods we call group 3. And ultra processed or UPFs we call group 4. So in the group 1, you'll see that these are the vegetables or grains or fruits or minimally processed food into in Indian bread, or you can see eggs and milk, or sometimes fermented into a yogurt and nuts, etc. So these are the foods which are we have been consuming as our traditional as well as cultural diets. So these are the ones which are getting replaced, and that's where the whole problem lies. And they much advertise, but when we come to UPFs later, and I just want to remind here that except for egg and milk, which occasionally is being advertised on the television for the purpose of drawing business in that sector, I don't see any other thing which is actually either the governments are leading into these efforts, in that sense that people try and pick up those foods as the foods to eat, and the provision of resources for people, whether they can manage to eat those foods. That's another important point here. When we come to group 2, these are actually the products we use to put for seasoning, make our food tasty, like salt and sugar, and they are actually obtained from the group 1 foods, the unprocessed foods, and they are consumed in whether it is butter or oil or sugar or salt, it's mostly for the taste purpose. The small press, like refining or grinding or milling, this is used for preparation of these foods, and they are mostly used for that purpose, and we continue to consume that to make our food culturally acceptable. And when we touch the processing part in that sense, which is the third type of NOVA classification, these are the foods again we produce from group 1 foods, the unprocessed foods, by adding oil or sugar or salt, or they are preserved in these cans, like the vegetables or the fruits. There's a lot of sugar or salt or other preservatives in them. Similarly, the cheese, you may have snacks like peanuts, or a lot of salt in that. These preserve as preservative as well as to be consumed. So what really matters here is that when we look into these processed foods, we need to look into the content, actually, the salt and the sugar. So that's an important element here. These foods are having those disadvantages with them. Now coming to the ultra processed foods, which is the topic of the day, and have very well explained, just to highlight the areas of how do we identify them. So these are like usually, these foods contain typically 5 or even more ingredients, which could be anything else. They are usually made in factories, industrially produced foods. They are, you will find that at least one of these ingredients in these foods, I'll show you a little later, but how do we look at them, is we don't use that in our kitchens. Very rarely. You will not ask for a taste enhancer or emulsifier or something like that when you prepare food in the kitchen, and you will not use these processes like firming or whipping your food. The content, as Maria said, that these are the parts of the food, they are whipped or carbonated, the bulk, or produced and for easy consumption and sale, and typically advertised. So these are the kind of ingredients. I will not go into the detail, like you will try to find out. They could be antioxidants, stabilizers, and preservatives. Like you can see the food containing lactose, whey, gluten, hydrogenated oils or hydrolyzed proteins, etc. Coloring agents, emulsifiers, or flavoring agents. Non-sugar sweeteners is something which the industry is now pitching to us as an alternative. When we say, oh, sugar is harmful, oh, so here comes the non-sugar stuff. So we need to be sticking to this key concept of ultra processed food if we have to define and pitch our health against the profits as well as against the consumption of this whole formulation as against the food. So I'll just quickly take you a few slides to try and put these into the age groups. So for the first 6 months, you have this breastfeeding, or some women, this is a general recommendation for all women, but somewhere the animal milk can also be used as real or unprocessed foods, as against these cans of baby milks from different companies, whether it is Nestle, Abbott, Johnson, Danone, so many companies. And yeah, these are the typical things you see in the market. Yeah, 6 months to 3 years, again, you'll see the on this side, the ultra processed food, having these cereal foods or the drinks for the babies, and then chocolates, ice creams, and then comes the chips and other snacks and biscuits, different types of biscuits with lots of sugar, chocolate filled in them, ice creams, as against the minimally processed foods, as is already discussed, which includes meals prepared at home, which could be a dessert or a porridge prepared at home, fruits, as well as milk, already discussed. So next 3 to 8 years, you see the increasing amount of food being replaced. And especially for India or other South Asian countries, I would say this is beginning to happen. As Maria showed a slide, we are increasing our sales of these foods. So the time is now to take action, both by ourselves, by our people whom we can reach out to as policymakers, who can stick to the how do we make available homemade meals, whether it is an Indian sweet dish called kheer or poha or chila. These are all Indian examples, as against the ultra processed foods like noodles, cold drinks like Cokes and Fantas, cakes and pastries, and now this trend of Horlicks and Bornvitas as healthy foods. Healthy drinks these are very common. In a small survey we did in Delhi, in 45 families, we found everybody is consuming without even noticing what is written on the label. So that's an important thing that we need to understand what we can do. And then 8 years and above, again, the same type of examples, we get into pizzas and fast food chickens, and packed and frozen chickens or kebabs, and then burgers, and alcohol also fits into the ultra processed foods, for example. And in the group 3, we have wines and beers also fitting into the ultra processed foods. I will not go into the harmful impacts. We already know that. So how do you reduce it? So the first step is identifying the ultra processed foods, and then you decide whether you want to buy or not. Be wary of the information. That's a critical point. Brazil has taken a lead in this and warning of its population to be wary of the information from the industry adverts. I'll also add on to this that trust information sources like WHO or the governments of India. I'm talking from India, that's why I'm saying, but all governments, I think. We should trust that, and public interest groups like NAPI and BPNI. I'm sure such groups exist in all countries. So this is an important point to remember, this generally speaking. So how to identify? These are usually advertised, celebrity endorsed, ready to eat or consume, convenient foods, positioned as convenient food. They are pitched as anytime, anywhere foods. And as one of the author of the Genius Food said, these are designed to be overconsumed. So that's where the whole harmful impact lies. When Maria showed the evidence of overweight, obesity, people eat more, by the nature of the food. Now here is an example to show you how do you actually make a identification of the label. So you need to look into the ingredients here. That look at here. This is wheat flour, refined wheat flour, sugar, coca solid, minerals, edible, vegetable oil, cereal extract, iodized salt, colors, vitamins, and so let's look at the numbers. You will probably find quickly to say, okay, this is a ultra processed food. Secondly, what you need also into the, even if it is lesser important than as the time goes, and you need to look into the this whole thing about sugar, and these carbohydrates are being misrepresented sometimes, and most of it is sugar actually, in whatever form it is. In this particular product, it's 25% actually in the whole survey. So, you can also go through the recent publication like in Guardian, and this is a very analytical publication, how ultra-processed food took over your shopping basket, and by Bee Wilson in February. This helps, and share this further. You can do in general recommendation for you or your family or your children or anybody you want to reach out to. Group 1 foods, make these as the basis of your diet. So this is recommended, again adapted from the Brazilian guidelines. Group 2 foods, use these in small amounts for seasoning and cooking, and for culinary preparation. Limit the use of processed foods, because you need to really check the salt and sugar content there when it is canned and all. And avoid ultra processed food products, as rightly said. And some people call it formulations also. These are not foods, these are formulations. So avoid formulations against foods. So you might have you can also, on our website, you can find this document, unseen dangers of which is being produced in several languages. English and Hindi is already done, others are being processed, and I'm sure other countries can also learn and include the different in their languages. I'm sure they're doing, Brazil is already doing it, and this is what people need to know, what are ultra processed foods and what are their dangers, so that people really go into. So when the industry pushes everything through marketing, this doesn't help people. They are not able to make the choices which they need to make for themselves, which are healthy. So you can share this information, talk about it in your state or in your country. You write about it, share and write about this. So on this website, you can find this advocacy document, which is simply conveying what we are talking about here, and take it further. So what the government, I'm sure Philip will talk about the policy options, but for the general, for Indian people, and for recommending to Government of India, for example, picking up NOVA classification, considering as a policy, and ensure the traffic light or a Chilean model of food labeling, where people can easily understand this food is not healthy, and advertisement of all ultra processed foods. These things are pending with our authorities. These are important that they are done as. So Indian government also needs to think about launching a new campaign, as other governments should junk the ultra processed foods. Whatever names we can give them, but this is important, that we need not partner, as Indian government is currently partnering with in its Eat Right campaign with all the food industry. We just keep on telling people to eat right, but it's important that we don't partner with food industry, which has a vested interest in selling their foods, and addition of super taxes to the ultra processed food sales. Thank you very much, friends. This is, we proudly say that information you can trust, coming from BPNI and NAPI. And over to you, Professor Sachdev.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arun, for your presentation, by illustrating to the audience with examples what are the foods in the various categories in the Indian context, and really pointing out the beast that we are fighting in the form of the industry mafia, the big celebrity advertisements, and in fact everything is stacked against us. And what I could gather from your presentation is, right now in India, perhaps we have to put the onus on ourselves or to our near immediate people by educating ourselves to prevent the dissemination of this practice amongst ourselves. Admittedly, these foods are convenient and cheap, and I see that they are there to stay, and you have suggested some possibilities of regulatory measures and measures to make the government aware of it and do that. I think that's a very important issue which we can discuss as we come towards the end. Thank you, Dr. Arun. Abhilasha, may I now request you to introduce the other speaker and for the presentation?
So let us welcome our next panelist, Dr. J.P. Dadich. Sir, please, you can start sharing your screen while I introduce you. He is Director Technical with BPNI India. He is MD Pediatrics, a fellow at National Neonatology Forum. He has been an integral part of BPNI since more than 1.5 decades now. He is a co-chair of the Global Council of International Baby Food Action Network. He has several publications in peer-reviewed journals and has contributed to several guidelines and chapters on breastfeeding and infant and young child feeding. Over to you, Dr. JP. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Abhilasha, and good evening, friends. We just listened about some very important facts regarding the ultra-processed foods. We also came to know about increasing consumption of these foods. And to increase their consumption, the companies are using every trick in the book. In the absence of effective and comprehensive global and national regulatory measures, manufacturers are promoting ultra-processed foods by influencing policy making, evidence generation through research, and consumer behavior through some examples of these predatory techniques used by the industry to enhance the sales of their products and increase the profits. But I start with a statement by the then WHO Director General, Dr. Margaret Chan, while speaking in the Global Conference on Health Promotion. I quote, "It is not just big tobacco anymore. Public health must also contend with big food, big soda, and big alcohol. All of these industries, they fear regulation and protect themselves by using the same tactics. Research has documented these tactics well. They include front groups, lobbies, promises of self-regulation, lawsuits, and industry-funded research that confuses the evidence and keeps the public in doubt. As we learned from experience with the tobacco industry, a powerful corporation can sell the public just about anything. Why it's not moving now. So let us first see how the industry influence and shape the public health and nutrition policy and strategy. I will share some examples from international arena as well as from national level from India, how involvement of industry in policy making results in the downplaying or weakening of control measures. Codex standards are the benchmark for the World Trade Organization, WTO, and are used to settle trade disputes. The food industry and its associations, they participate in the international meetings of this important policy-making process as observers. But more importantly, food industry representatives are included in the official delegations by some member states. This is a clear conflict of interest in which the industry, who is supposed to follow the standards being discussed in the meeting, also decides what those standards should be. It violates the basic principle that no one should be the judge in his or her own cause. In the meeting, for example, in the meeting of Codex Committee on Nutrition and Food for Special Dietary Use in 2019 in Germany, of the 370 delegates listed as participants, 164, that is 44%, were from food industries and their associations. 67 of them were part of the official government delegation of countries. Infant formula producing countries had formula industry representatives in official delegations. Australia had Nuche Foods, USA had Mead Johnson, and New Zealand had Fonterra. The meeting was discussing revised standards for follow-on formula, and formula producing countries registered inclusion of specific reference to prohibit cross-promotion on the labels of these products. It is important to note that avoiding cross-promotion of products is in line with the guidelines by WHO. The committee dropped reference to cross-promotion on the labels. Instead, it adopted a much weaker text. This happened in spite of strong support from many developing countries to include it. There is another example of interference by food companies in the public policy making and program implementation. In 2018, the Food Safety and Standard Regulator of India, FSSAI, launched a program named Diet for Life to address needs of infants suffering with the inborn error of metabolism. 4 baby food companies, namely Abbott, Danone, Mead Johnson, and Nestle, floated a voluntary organization, Infant and Young Child Nutrition Council of India, in short IYNCI. FSSAI included IYNCI in the steering committee of Diet for Life program. Scientific panel on functional foods and nutraceuticals, etc. of FSSAI gave permission to all these baby food companies to import the special formula for IEM and also hypoallergenic formula. According to the IMS Act, the Indian law to implement the International Code of Marketing of BMS, all these products come into its purview, but FSSAI exempted these products from abiding with the IMS Act. This is a classic case of how food companies influence the public policy and program, posed as a part of the solution to a problem, and got away with regulatory exemptions in the bargain. Now, this is not a coincidence that a scientist who is a former director of National Institute of Nutrition, a Government of India organization, was a member of the scientific panel of FSSAI, which gave permission of importing the products and exempting them from provisions of the IMS Act. And he is also a member of the advisory body of Industry Front IYNCI. Again, this is a clear case of conflicts of interest. Armed with the exemption granted by the FSSAI, Danone and Abbott sponsored annual convention of the National Neonatology Forum of India in 2017. They displayed their products in the conference exhibition area. With the effective advocacy by the civil society and exemplary role played by the media in highlighting flouting of established norms, FSSAI removed the IYNCI from the steering committee of Diet for Life program and withdrew the blanket exemption given to the industry from abiding the IMS Act. So now let us see some instances of manipulation of biomedical research by food industry. As we know, biomedical research is crucial in developing clinical guidelines, formulating national policies, and making patient care decisions. It is therefore important that the biomedical research is kept free from fraud, misconduct, and conflicts of interest. Industry sponsors the research and interferes in evidence generation process in various ways, like having a bias in the choice of hypothesis to be tested, manipulating study design, having selective publication when negative results are not reported, and supporting fraudulent research. This cartoon depicts the modus operandi of the industry-supported research very well. In the scientific method, the investigator is saying to the assistant, here are the facts. What conclusions can we draw from them? It's fair enough. I mean, it should be like this only. But in the creationist method, the investigator is saying, here is the conclusion. What facts can you find to support it? And this is a clear manipulation of research. Here is an example of industry manipulating research outcomes. In 1967, a review was published in the journal NEGM titled Dietary Fats, Carbohydrates, and Atherosclerotic Vascular Disease. It singled out fat and cholesterol as the dietary causes of coronary heart disease and downplayed the evidence that sucrose consumption was also a risk factor. An analysis of internal industry documents published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2017 revealed some startling facts. It found that in 1965, the Sugar Research Foundation, that is SRF, The Sucrose Industries Washington DC-based trade association sponsored the above-mentioned research to review dietary causes of coronary heart disease. The SRF not only funded the research, it also had a role in the setting of reviews objectives. It contributed articles for inclusion and received drafts for comments. The funding and interference by the SRF in conducting the research was not disclosed in the published review. As a result of conclusions drawn in the 1965 review, the role of sugar in causing coronary heart disease was not analyzed properly. Findings of this study were cited widely in the subsequent research studies and used while developing guidelines for preventing coronary heart disease. One of the scientists who wrote this review in NEJM went on to become the head of nutrition at the United States Department of Agriculture. He used his research to influence the government's dietary recommendations, which emphasized saturated fat as a driver of heart disease, while largely characterizing sugar as empty calories, only linked to tooth decay. Another example of efforts to influence scientific research is this saga of Global Energy Balance Network, that is GEBN in the USA. GEBN comprised of a group of scientists, and it was established by Coca-Cola with necessary financial and logistic support. Coca-Cola made a concerted effort at distancing itself from the GEBN to conceal its involvement so that GEBN can be portrayed as independent. Some researchers accessed internal company documents and published a review article in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health in 2018. And company documents revealed that Coca-Cola established GEBN as an honest broker and wanted it to serve as a weapon to change the conversation about obesity towards energy balance. GEBN promoted the idea that exercise is key to health and weight loss rather than the consumption of sugary drinks. GEBN's mandate was to run extensive advocacy campaign linking researchers, policymakers, health professionals, journalists, and the general public to influence the narrative about obesity. But with intense scrutiny by media and public health authorities, the GEBN announced in 2015 that it is closing down. This is very interesting. NOVA classification, as we know, informs about the unhealthiness of ultra-processed foods. Now NOVA is being criticized, and who is doing it? A recent analysis by Dr. Melissa Mellon and colleagues have found 32 articles critical of NOVA by 38 authors. And 33 out of 38 authors were having some relationship with ultra-processed foods and beverage products. 7 were actually industry employees. 26 had declared or undeclared conflicts of interest. And they also identified 10 organizations hosting the criticism of NOVA who had relationship with UPP manufacturers. This is again a kind of manipulative effort on part of the food industry to denounce any effort by public interest researchers to bring forward critical information about the unhealthy ultra-processed foods. Now I will tell you briefly how the industry is influencing consumer behavior to increase sales of ultra-processed foods through ad campaigns, health and nutrition claims, and sponsorships of children's program and sports events. Promoting ultra-processed food product Maggie through a celebrity endorsement as a healthy replacement of real food, saying goodness of fiber of 3 Indian breads without telling that its sodium content is very high. Then promoting ultra-processed food as a source of nutrient and replacing real food, in this case saying as much iron as in 100 grams of spinach, again hiding the fact that its 200 ml pack contains more than 24 grams sugar. Promoting ultra-processed foods like a high sugar drink, Pediatrics some unsubstantiated health claims like children will have 50% less infection and 50% more growth with its use. It is important here to note that 100 grams of this product contains more than 25 grams of sugar. Again, using endorsement from a celebrity and promoting a high sugar drink like Horlicks as a solution for malnutrition. It very clearly used the name of a government of India nutrition program, that is Poshan Abhiyan. Abhiyan means mission in Hindi, while whitewashing the inconvenient fact that very high sugar content of more than 26%. then promoting a high sugar drink Bournvita containing 37% sugar by sponsoring a popular children's quiz on TV, which was running on Indian TV for many, many years. And then sponsoring a popular sports event, Indian Premier League of Cricket, and promoting sugar-sweetened beverage Pepsi. In summary, to increase the consumption of their products and profit, ultra-processed food industry has penetrated the scientific community, public policy making, and program implementation to create a friendly environment for their business, and they are using a variety of promotional methods to change consumer behavior. This cartoon, which depicts tactics of tobacco industry in denying addictive nature of tobacco and therefore suggesting continued use of the product, says cigarettes are not addictive, cigars are not addictive, smokeless tobacco is not addictive, so only profits are addictive. It fits very well for the processed food companies also. So there is a need to have effective and comprehensive global and national regulatory measures to stop this greed. So this is all about, I wanted to share with you about marketing and all other issues related with ultra-processed food. Thanks for your attention. I stop here and I will be happy to answer any questions from you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dijit, for a very useful and illustrative talk highlighting not only the overt methods that industry legitimately uses to promote their products through advertising, using celebrities, and making tall claims like this is going to do X, Y, or promising the moon. But at the same time, you have also provided a glimpse of how powerful the industry is by going through covert methods. They have infiltrated into the regulatory systems, the government, the research field, and even the guideline making groups. So this is something which has to be considered. And certainly, as you say, at the bottom of the crux of the problem is only profits that are addictive, and continuing this, like in the tobacco industry, the simile is similar. So thank you so much. Now, Abhilasha, I would request you to introduce the next speaker.
All right. So as I invite our next panelist, Dr. Philip Baker, I would want to welcome him again because he has joined us a little late. Welcome you, Dr. Philip Baker. I request you to kindly share your screen as I start to introduce you. So Dr. Philip Baker is a research fellow at Deakin University, Australia, and he is a member of the Institute for Physical Activity and Nutrition. He holds a PhD from the National Centre of Epidemiology and Population Health, Australian National University. His research focuses on understanding the links between food system change, the nutrition transition, public health and sustainability, and on informing policy and programming actions to prevent undernutrition, obesity, and non-communicable diseases in Australia and internationally. Much of his recent work has focused on the political economy of food systems and nutrition, ultra-processed foods, infant and child nutrition, and on global nutrition politics and governance. Dr. Baker is a member of independent expert group of the Global Nutrition Report. He was recently a fellow of the Lancet Commission on Obesity. The screen is all yours, Dr. Baker. You have 15 minutes. Your mic is off, Dr. Philip.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much for the introduction, and a warm hello to good friends and colleagues all around the world, and especially to my great friends and colleagues in India. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on this really important topic, and congratulations to Arun and colleagues at BPNI for the launch of these two documents on ultra-processed foods, which are really important, and a very clear demarcation between real foods and ultra-processed foods. So the focus of my presentation, and I hope I can do justice to it after the so many great presentations before me, is to focus on this question of what are the policy responses to ultra processed foods in global context. So by policy responses, I mean, the first time I came across the term policy response, I rolled my eyes and I thought policy sounds like one of the most boring things you can possibly ever talk about or think about. But as I came to learn more about what policy is, I became absolutely fascinated by it. And the way I sort of describe policy response, the term policy response now, is how do we organize a societal response to problems, to things that cause harm, but also on the flip side, how do we promote social goods? And in this talk, we're talking about ultra processed foods, and without a doubt, ultra processed foods are what we would consider harmful. Now, this is a shameless plug for two publications that our team at Deakin University have. One publication is, the first is by one of our fantastic postgraduate students, Leonie Elizabeth, which is a review on ultra-processed foods and health outcomes. It summarizes the literature showing that ultra-processed foods are linked with a number of adverse health outcomes in both adults and children and adolescents. The second paper on the right is a forthcoming paper that we currently have under review, and this is on the topic of ultra-processed foods and the nutrition transition. And this paper really investigates the global trends and patterns in ultra-processed food sales around the world, but then it looks at what are the food systems transformations that are driving changes in ultra-processed food markets around the world, in particular the commercial drivers linked with the transnationalization of the food and beverage industry. And then finally, we look at what are the political economy drivers. So political economy refers to power and influence. How are the corporations influencing policy and regulation around the world to facilitate consumption? So please watch this space. Hopefully this paper will be out shortly. So the first question to ask when talking about policy is, what is the policy problem? We really need to clearly define what it is that we are responding to, what it is that we intend to regulate. Now, I think, as I've said, ultra-processed foods are what we'd call a harm, a social harm, an environmental harm, but also there are other ways of thinking about this. So the first way in which ultra-processed foods are harmful is harmful to health. And I think we've heard from others tonight a summary of the evidence around those adverse health outcomes linked with dietary exposure to ultra-processed foods. There are also major equity implications of ultra-processed foods. As in low-income country contexts, tends to be wealthier, higher income groups that consume these foods. But then as countries get richer, we see this social transition in consumption. It tends to be lower socioeconomic groups in richer countries that consume more of these foods. So there are important equity impacts of ultra-processed food consumption. Now, there are identified harms of these foods to the environment as well. There's mixed results in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But one of the key environmental impacts of ultra-processed foods is the plastic waste, and they comprise a significant proportion of the plastic waste stream entering into our marine ecosystems. Third, the marketing of ultra-processed foods has been identified by UNICEF, by WHO, by authoritative research reports as undermining the rights of the child. Fourth, to food culture, as these foods globalize, as they have impacts on traditional food cultures, they also have social impacts in terms of the way these foods are consumed. mindless consumption, snacking, the decline in commensal eating that results from that. And there's also an identified culinary skills transition. So is the availability of certain types of ultra-processed foods that are ready to eat, ready to heat, ready meals, for example, being one of them, resulting in a decline in culinary skills, our ability to cook and prepare traditional foods, whole foods, home-prepared foods, and that's another impact. And in general, these foods are contributing to unhealthy and unsustainable diets, and by extension, unhealthy and unsustainable food systems. Yet, despite these harms, ultra-processed food sales are rising nearly everywhere. And this is data from our forthcoming paper. We simply show that in every region and across all country income levels, ultra-processed food sales are increasing. This is not data. We also show data for ultra-processed food beverages, and there are some interesting dynamics underway there. But I don't have quite enough time to go into that. But in essence, what are the broad policy objectives? Now, these are broad policy objectives. I'm not saying these are policy objectives in relation to, say, specific actions like taxing foods or labeling foods. These are broad policy objectives in relation to reducing the harms associated with ultra-processed foods. And this is how I would define them. This is just my own interpretation. But one would be halt the rise. So we need to stop the increase in consumption. Number two, we need to draw down or reduce consumption. And number three, we need to minimize the harms associated with existing consumption. We'll get into how we might achieve that by looking at some of the policy actions. Now, first of all, what explains rising ultra-processed food consumption worldwide? Because this is the essence of policy. If we can understand what's driving the problem, we can understand how to respond to it. Now, one of the narratives that we do hear, and we have heard time and time again, is that ultra-processed food consumption is a matter of choice, and it results from a lack of personal responsibility. This is an argument we've heard from the food industry from time to time, and food industry lobby groups. However, if this was logically the case, we would expect rising consumption worldwide to result from a decline in personal responsibility. But that is a logical fallacy. If anything, we have seen increasing personal responsibility in other areas of social activity, like smoking cessation, for example, has gone down. We're seeing rising responsibility in many other areas of social activity. This is a logical fallacy. The idea that somehow global personal responsibility has declined is ridiculous. The alternative view that we put forward in this upcoming paper is that rising ultra-processed food consumption really reflects fundamental transformations in the nature of our food system. So first of all, we can explain a lot of it by changing factors that drive demand: rising incomes, urbanization, increasing time pressures on families, demand for convenience, and so on. But it also reflects fundamental changes in our food supply and our food environments, a lot of which are being driven by the transnational food and beverage companies. So the first thing that we've seen, that we describe, is relates to the production of ingredients that are used in ultra-processed food manufacturing. Now, in this graph, we show this huge increase in the production of sugar and vegetable oils. Sugar and vegetable oils are sweetness and fat that we find in most ultra-processed foods. And we've seen this massive increase in production worldwide, and this provides a cheap and readily available production input. The third is manufacturing. So since the 1980s, the food manufacturers have more intensively globalized. They've gone much more strongly into especially middle-income countries, making investments in production facilities and so on. And we call this sort of a general process of co-colonization. Fourth is technological change. So food processing, food manufacturing, food science technology is being used to create novel ingredients, to make foods that are hyper palatable and so on. We've seen a retail transformation, so the rise of supermarkets in many low and middle income countries, and the supermarkets tend to distribute ultra processed foods more than traditional retail outlets. It's not all bad for nutrition, but there is this link with supermarkets. The next is marketing. So traditional mass media marketing is continuing, but we've seen this huge push into digital, and digital marketing based around big data systems, individualizing marketing messaging, and so on. We've also seen, of course, that this is all occurring against this backdrop of trade and investment liberalization. So reductions in barriers to cross-border trade and investment means these companies can expand their global production, sourcing, and distribution networks more easily. And finally, it relates to changes in the political economy of the food system. And here we see the rise in the market and political power of big food throughout the food system. Okay, so if we are to respond to ultra-processed foods, let's say we want to put policies in place, regulatory frameworks, use our food regulatory system to halt the rise, to draw down consumption, and to minimize harm. What are the principles and some of the frameworks we can use to guide action? Well, some of the frameworks that I've really looked to and our group looks to is the Global Action Plan on NCDs from WHO, the Nourishing Framework from the World Cancer Research Fund by Karina Hawkes and colleagues. There are also other really excellent frameworks and guiding principles from FAO and the WHO, from the high-level panel of experts on the Committee of Food Security, which look at this question of what are sustainable healthy diets, what are the food systems drivers of nutrition, and they offer some really good guidance too. But the main principles are we need to take a systems-based approach. So if rising ultra-processed foods are driven by a changing food system, we need to take a whole of food system approach to policy and regulatory responses. And we need to integrate these within national food and nutrition policies more broadly. We take an equity and rights-based approach, a life course approach, of course, beginning with maternal nutrition, early life nutrition from 0 to 36 months, breast milk substitutes are the first ultra-processed foods many children are exposed to, of course. We need to use fit-for-purpose evidence. We need to manage conflicts of interest in food and in policy and regulatory decision-making. This is actually a crucial one that JP just referred to in relation to Codex. And we need to take national action, but we also need to cooperate internationally. And this is why presentations like these are so important. In terms of the actual frameworks, these are sort of some of the actions that that are part of these frameworks: nutrition labeling, public procurement, public institution standards like school food standards, using taxes and subsidies, restricting food advertising, and so on. And I think you probably, I won't go through the whole list because it's quite extensive, but there's some references there for further reading. So how are we tracking so far in global context? In terms of what's our track record in responding to ultra-processed foods to reducing harm? So two reports that we can go to here that summarize the evidence concisely is the WHO reports on national capacity for responding to non-communicable diseases and the Global Nutrition Policy Review. Now, I've demarcated here between two types of policy actions. The first are government actions targeting lifestyle behavioral change. So these are education and counseling and media campaigns. And we see that the majority of governments around the world have adopted these types of interventions. They're not just targeting ultra-processed foods. In fact, the minority of these education and media campaigns are more about promoting healthy food. But you can see that this is the preferred option for many governments around the world. When we go to actions targeting the food supply and food environments, school food standards, around 43% of governments reporting there. Taxes on sugar, sweetened beverages have really taken off in the last decade, 38%, but much fewer on unhealthy foods. And this, I think, is a big problem. This focus just on sugary drinks has been a good one and strategic move, but we're letting these ultra-processed foods get away these other types of ultra-processed foods are largely untaxed. Elimination of industrially produced trans fats, restrictions on marketing foods and beverages to children. Only 35% of countries have a policy in place, of which there's a mix of mandatory self-regulation and co-regulation. This is probably going to be one of the most important responses we can take globally, is this restriction on marketing foods and beverages. And I think this is probably where a lot more of the focus needs to be. And then we have front of pack labeling schemes, portion size controls. There are a number of other actions being taken. And overall, you can see that there's a skew here towards lifestyle behavioral change interventions. And this skew towards lifestyle behavioral interventions is really a problem. We need much more upstream actions targeting the structural determinants and the commercial determinants of ultra-processed food consumption. Now, some of the other sort of important considerations here in terms of policy action are using the right types of descriptors for these foods in food-based dietary guidelines. Now, one of the problems we've had to date is the use of these terms, like these nutrients, what I call nutrient-centric terms, like energy-dense, nutrient-poor, high sugar, salt, and fat, or these choice-orientated or consumer-centric terms like discretionary or non-core. The choice is at the discretion of the consumer, which is an individualizing or consumer-centric framing of these problems. Much fewer dietary guidelines use processing or producer-centric language, highly processed or ultra-processed. In fact, only Brazil, Peru, Uruguay, and Ecuador use the ultra-processed food concept in their dietary guidelines. Canada uses highly processed. I think maybe a few others use the term highly processed. But there's this is a real challenge, is to get this degree of processing and ultra processed or highly processed language into food-based dietary guidelines. Other actions include adopting food-based profiling into dietary guidelines. So that includes adopting NOVA, for example, into dietary guidelines and to guide policy action. Whole food reformulation, so not just reformulating the nutrient content of foods, but actually reducing the degree of processing. So making ultra-processed foods, processed foods. And we see this with bread, for example. Ultra-processed breads are kind of unnecessary. You can have processed breads. So there's opportunity to shift to whole food reformulation. Promoting hand-prepared and home-prepared foods, and protecting traditional food cultures. So deliberate policy actions like in Japan and South Korea to maintain traditional food cultures that resist the influence of the transnational companies and this force of westernization. So what's holding us back in terms of policy action? Well, as JP and others have already said, the power of the ultra-processed food industry is the gorilla in the policy making room. And a number of articles now just really clearly describe the food industry playbook. Work by Melissa Mielon and colleagues and others on the commercial determinants of health show this. We in this recent review we did on what drives political commitment for nutrition, we found that this is the single most important intervention barrier to achieving food regulations for ultra-processed foods. The playbook is, as JP has already outlined, lobbying, framing the debate, funding research studies, and so on. And you can see on the bottom right there, which is the marketing, the policy risk matrix and lobbying focus of Coca-Cola in Europe, and how they sort of think about all the issues that are coming across their radar and what they should prioritize. The second major barrier is what I would call, or what we would call, reductionism. So using nutrient profiling models only to profile the healthfulness of foods. So there are about 97 of these nutrient profiling models used around the world. And they're algorithmic. They look at the nutrient content of foods, and they're used to assess which foods meet particular classifications for the purposes of policy and regulation. So if they're under a particular score, they might be allowed to be marketed on television, for example. If they're over a particular score, or they might be restricted under advertising rules, for example. Now, this is problematic in many ways. I'm not saying it's not important, it is important, but it is problematic if we just use this approach. If we need to use this in combination with food profiling. So we need to, first of all, say, is this food an ultra-processed food or not? Because if it is an ultra-processed food, then changing the nutrient content isn't going to make it less ultra-processed. And what we've seen is this around the world is this focus on nutrients to limit reformulation. The reformulation of junk food, the swapping nutrients in and out, or reducing nutrients to make them meet these nutrient profiling criteria. We've also seen the fortification of ultra-processed foods, the functionalization of ultra-processed foods, which are used by industry as a marketing strategy. So we've all seen sugary cereal boxes with, fortified with micronutrients on the front. But yeah, my way of sort of framing this is a reformulated ultra-processed food is almost always still an ultra-processed food. So finally, I just want to conclude with what's our public health playbook. We have lots of really good evidence now from all around the world, especially in relation to sugar sweetened beverage taxes, about what enables policy change, regulatory change in response to ultra-processed foods. Lots of great research out of Latin America. And it's all things that we probably know really well. So the mobilization of a broad-based civil society movement around the issue, strategic advocacy, top-down political commitment, so leadership from parliamentarians, from congressmen within government, sustained over time. And importantly, and this is something we don't talk about enough, is we need the resources and the capacity to design, implement, and monitor these types of policy actions. There's a lot of technical and legal requirements for designing a sugar sweetened beverage tax, for example. The other thing is financial support for social lobbying, so actually directly funding civil society groups, providing funding for the establishment of civil society coalitions, as Bloomberg Philanthropies did throughout Latin America. And the capacity to defend against ongoing industry opposition, because once you get a regulation in place, you then have to defend it again, usually have to defend it against ongoing industry opposition and attack. So I'll end there, and I'm sorry I have spoken for far too long, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Phil, for letting us know the possibilities after a good review of the evidence and other facets of tackling the menace of ultra-processed foods. You have outlined the role of the individual as well as primarily the systems approach, and why this demon is not going to go away so soon because of several forces and several things, including the reductionist tendency, and still the guidelines at the global level do tend to talk about fortification and the other things. Plus, I think at the base, you did point out that it's a big food, which means a lot of money, and it's difficult to convince the governments about it. So you have tried to suggest both a top-down and a bottom-up approach for all the actions. So thank you very much for this thing. So at the end of this, we come to the end of the formal presentations of this fascinating webinar that we have had in these challenging times. It began with the presentation by Maria of defining what are ultra-processed foods, and there are shades of processing, and how they are adversely impacting the health, primarily obesity, non-communicable diseases, and recent data on depression, cancers, and all-cause mortality. And what are the factors or the various mechanisms through which these are likely to operate to cause this, one of that being hyperpalatability, excess composition of the unhealthy components, and reduction of the healthy components in the diet as a complete food matrix. And after that, Arun did point out the various practical features or how to recognize the foods in the Indian context, and what are the various factors or the possibilities in the Indian context, which is still some distance away from reaching what the Americas and the developed world has reached the levels, what could be done, mostly focused on the individual actions, plus he thought of and did convey some regulatory possibilities or how to force the government to try to recognize this and do. After that, JP pointed out the covert and the overt ways in which food industry is trying to influence all of these things so that this thing is there to stay and achieves a permanence, and because profits are addictive. And finally, Phil laid down the possibilities of the policy action, and which I just enumerated a little while ago, and he did also allude to the possibility that there is a difficulty in getting this definition accepted internationally or globally, because some people use the reductionist approach on the high sugar salt content, some use the ultra processed, and some use other terminology. So that in brief is a summary, and I think it would be helpful to have a response to the several questions that we are having first, and after that we may get an idea. I could ask each of the speakers for their possibilities on what can be done about this, and following that we will try to end it. So let me first start with the question which is by Pooja Chanda. Today's generation, due to the busy schedule, many prefer ultra-processed foods like Maggi, cornflakes, as they are easy to cook or make. Again, for children, along with breastfeeding, the parents also feed the child with naan, Cerelac, etc. My question is that does these foods are a factor of having less appetite and having many health issues in children, mainly gastric, constipation, indigestion? What are the alternatives and treatments? Would you like to answer that, Arun?
I can. I will also request Maria to add on to the implication on health. So most of these foods which Pooja has asked about, the point is I don't remember that reading anything about causing except for gaining the appetite. I think they eat more, and there's a lot of harmful products in them. So I am not getting the right thing question in my mind, that what exactly, in terms of constipation or indigestion or so.
Well, let me try to help you out, Arun, here. I think the issue is correct here. Yes, they have the possibility of leading to constipation, indigestion, and gastric irritability, primarily because they take away the bulk from the main diet. The bulk meaning the fibers and the water and all these supplies. So yes, they could lead to this, and the best is to put them on the main foods.
Yeah.
So the next question, Maria, I think you will have to help me out. It looks to be in Spanish, and if you could read that and explain to us, from Elda Famba.
It's in Portuguese, but she's just like saying thank you for the information and asking if it's possible to share the slides, the presentation.
Yeah, I think there have been several requests by people to share the rise. Abhilasha, can you let people know? I am seeing it here. It has been recorded live on the Facebook. So could you tell them whether they could take it from the Facebook? And I would request that since some of the slides could contain data which is unpublished as yet, could you kindly contact the speakers individually to get these slides rather than we will also explore the possibility of putting them on the site if the speakers are in agreement.
Can I just like add some
Yes, please.
information regarding like the first question? I talked a little bit about the systematic review we have done this year, and it's important to highlight that the evidence regarding children and adolescents is not so consistent as the evidence in adults. So we have still like a lack of evidence, especially regarding younger children. So we've found like 54 studies, but only like 13 in children. And like most of these studies were actually in like adolescents, not really in children. There are 2 studies in adults that show the impact of ultra-processed foods on gastrointestinal disturbances. It includes like constipation and like inflammation, but none in children. So we still have to conduct more studies and mainly like high quality studies in small children.
Thank you for this important addition, Maria. Again, I think there's a comment by Ramachandran Thiruvangadam. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. If it is not possible to release a video recording of webinar, it would be immensely useful to share a brief note with the reference of scientific articles discussed here. And there's another comment later on about sharing the emails of the speakers. So, Abhilasha, could you or Arun, could you respond to this question?
Yeah, we have been hosting a few seminars in the past 2 months, and the practice has been we ask the panelists if they permit, then we share the record. We do share the recordings with the, so it's possible that all the recording actually done on the Zoom is possibly shared by a link with all the participants to this and all those who have not been able to participate but they register. So that is possible. So I just saw a response from Phil. He is willing, and if Maria can confirm, we can share your slides, and I confirm that we can share. And JP, if you confirm that, if we confirm that, then we will share the full recording with all the participants. Yeah.
Thank you. The next is by an anonymous attendee, which has been answered earlier regarding constipation in children, adolescents, and indigestion. So I'll skip this. Again, from another anonymous attendee, dear sir, this is a wonderful session. As a student working closely with rural communities, I observed alarming instances of high consumption of ultra-processed foods, and it's very difficult to convince a mother to avoid these, especially health drinks and biscuits, a huge challenge. Most of the time, these foods substitute regular meals due to so many factors such as time and workload of mothers. I would like to learn from your experiences on strategies that can be used when confronting these issues in field or directly with mothers. This pertains mostly to India, I think. So, JP, would you like to give it a shot, or Arun?
Yeah, go ahead, JP. Yeah. JP, your mic.
Can you repeat the question, sir? Which question is this?
The question was that in our setting, a lot of women in poor rural countries are using this, and can you suggest something to overcome this?
Yeah, I think as Dr. Arun has already described what is the real food and in comparison to what, and age-wise also. So this information is now available in the document which BPNI has prepared, and it will be available in many languages now. So I think it will be very useful if the person who has asked this question goes through this this document and have all the information there. And a lot of work has to be done because nothing actually has been done on this front. Having a campaign informing the parents about the risks of all these ultra processed foods and benefits of having the real food.
So can I request you to be to the point, because I see the questions are swelling. So if you can be crisp and short, it would be helpful.
Yeah. So I will request them to go through the document which we have prepared. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
By Umesh Khurana, the market is now having a surge of energy drinks. What are their merits or demerits? Phil, would you like to answer this?
Sorry, would you mind repeating the question?
The market is now having a surge of energy drinks. What are their merits or demerits?
Yeah, so this is something that we picked up on in our forthcoming paper, is that beverage markets are changing quite in interesting ways around the world. So what we're seeing is a decline in many countries of carbonated soft drinks. So the colas, you know, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Fanta, those types of drinks are going down in many countries, and especially in high-income countries. What we're seeing is the industry responding through this simple strategy of product diversification. So this includes expanding sales of other types of drinks. And one of those key types of drinks that they're expanding is energy drinks. And energy drinks, there's some great work being done from colleagues in Europe looking at these foods. These types of drinks is particularly harmful for a number of reasons. One is because they contain pseudo-addictive substances like caffeine, taurine, other types of stimulants. The second is that they are targeted at, they tend to be targeted at young teenage boys, and that's where we see a lot of this consumption. And of course they're often very high in sugar or artificial sweeteners. So yeah, I mean, I just think as a nutritional, as a food product, as a beverage product, of course they are about as ultra processed as you get. I mean, they're extremely unhealthy.
So I think you could answer the next question also, which says tobacco consumption was managed by increased taxes on cigarettes. Similarly, how much tax elevation is needed for carbonated beverages, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Thumbs Up, etc.?
So I think the recommendation is to aim for 20%, and that's when you start to see the real impacts. But I think even with much lower tax rates in Mexico and other places, for example, you still see we'll still meet the policy objectives. So we're still seeing, you know, significant impacts at 10%. But the questions around whether that tax is applied to the producer or at the point of consumption. So this is questions around tax design, and this is actually really important. It's a really important question, because how you design the tax, the rate of the tax, whether it's an excise tax or an ad valorem tax, is different types of taxes, has an important impact. Whether the tax is tiered or not, whether they're different levels of tax for different levels of, say, sugar consumption per unit volume. So I'd say if you're interested in that question, how to design a tax, really check out some of the guidance from WHO and others on that.
Thank you. Next is a comment by Patty Rundle. She says, to me, the deals being struck with the companies now, the Nutrition for Growth, the recent BMS call to action, all lead to partnerships with the biggest corporations with pathetic commercially influenced monitoring via access to nutrition. You want to comment on the comment, Arun?
I think that what Patty is saying is right. It's gained the part, as JP has already illustrated, the whole partnership with most of the companies.
Thank you then.
To get into the government.
You agree wholeheartedly. So next is by Adriano Catenio to Phil. Phil, is the traffic light front of the pack labeling to be included into reductionist strategies?
Yeah, so the main application of the nutrient profiling modeling is food labeling. And so you see a huge diversity of food labels being applied around the world. So you have multi-traffic light labeling. In some countries, you have the Health Star rating here in Australia and New Zealand. You have Nutri-Score in France, the keyholes in Scandinavia, and so on. And most of these are based upon a nutrient profiling model, which is an algorithm which assesses the the nutrient content of the food, of the packaged food, and whether it meets certain criteria to then put, the red traffic light or the orange or the green or the keyhole or whatever Nutri-Score it gets, for example. And I think it's important to say that, what I'm not saying is that work's not important. It is important to, and there is a role for doing that, for having these nutrient approaches to nutrient profiling. But if we only do that, then we're sort of losing focus of this broader issue of food processing, because what we're saying with ultra processed foods is not just nutrients. It's not just nutrients to limit. There are all these other things that are going into ultra processed foods, cosmetic additives and so on, plasticizers. There are contaminants that are occurring because of the processing. There's a degradation of the food matrix, and these are having biological impacts that are causing adverse health outcomes irrespective of the nutrient content. And that's the key thing. So we need to have a food profiling approach that demarcates these foods, first of all, to say this is an ultra processed food. Then we apply the nutrient profiling. That's when we should then, step 2 would be to apply the nutrient profiling. But at the moment, we're only really doing the nutrient profiling. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks. So there is another question to you from Shruti Sachdeva. Can you please elaborate on concept of whole food reformulation discussed by Dr. Baker?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So when we talk about reformulation at the moment, we usually talk about nutrient reformulation, and most of it is around nutrients to limit reformulation. So and usually that reformulation sort of involves something like reducing the sugar content or eliminating trans fats, and often that involves replacing those with something else. So artificial sweeteners, usually some other ultra processed food ingredient. Okay, and so like I said before, a reformulated ultra processed food is still an ultra processed food. Whole food reformulation is when you reduce the degree of processing of the food itself. So this is not about changing the nutrient profile of the food so much as it is about reducing the industrial processing of the food. So that could mean, for example, removing cosmetic additives completely from the food. That doesn't mean removing all additives. So, preservatives are still used in processed foods, for example. It could also mean maintaining the food matrix, so maintaining the structural integrity of the food for using different types of processing techniques. And probably the good example here is that if you take the category of bread, a bread that you find in a supermarket or a store, you can often differentiate between artisanal breads, which are processed, and ultra processed breads, which tend to be more the Wonder Whites, the highly refined flours. And so those are two examples of different degree of the same food category essentially, but different degrees of processing applied. So I think hopefully that makes sense in terms of what I mean by whole food reformulation, reducing the.
The next comment or question is from Professor Vinu Seth. The professional community is well aware of the facts discussed of the ultra-processed foods. How does this information get to policymakers, and shouldn't they be somehow involved in such webinars? Arun?
Yes, that's a good idea. That's what we always try and do, invite everyone to such seminars. And I do see that there is interest is growing slowly, but the whole influence of industry on the Indian context, Food Safety Authority, that there is a Eat Right campaign going on in the country, which Government of India thinks that is enough. to lead this work. But that is very soft because all the industry is a partner there. So we are trying to reach out to, and after this, as somebody has rightly suggested, we'll take a formal note of this webinar, and endorsed people, we'll reach out to these people who have attended, and if they endorse, we will write a advocacy note to the Government of India, to the attending policymakers to bring policy changes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is to Maria by Zinat Aman. How many times can ultra processed foods be used in daily life, especially red meat?
Oh, this is a really difficult question. I think there is no answer for this question. What the studies show to us is that there is a dose-response association between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and many diseases. So, like, the more you eat ultra-processed food, the higher is the risk of many diseases such as obesity, cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. And regarding ready meat, although there are many studies showing health impacts or impacts of the consumption of red meat on diseases, red meat itself is not ultra processed food. It's like, if it's freshly made, it's in group 1 of NOVA classification. And it's important to highlight that not all foods within the groups of NOVA are the same, and they have like different nutritional compositions and different impacts on health. So red meat is still like in group 1 of NOVA, although we know that, for example, vegetables and fruits, they have like a protective effect on health, and red meat does not. But I think there is not a consensus on like what's the amount we could eat of ultra processed foods to be like safe.
Thank you, Maria. This is also an interesting one, and I think you should try to answer this. Oh, I don't know where this goes. It said something to the effect that we use bacteria for producing curd and other things like that. What is your opinion about producing them for alcohol? Using them for producing alcohol?
I think like alcoholic beverages are a different type of food, and we should like look at alcoholic beverages in a different way. We have to regulate these beverages because they have like other impacts on society and health, that the mechanisms, the way they impact on health in the society are different. So when you talk about non-alcoholic fermentation, the fermentation used to make like yogurt, this is like a minimally processed way to make food. Yogurt is still in group 1, but when you talk about alcoholic beverage, we need like to shift a little bit the way we change. So it's not worth to mix like alcoholic beverages with ultra processed foods.
Thank you. There's a comment by Selvan Rathinasamy. We can guide parents in easy cooking ways. Agreed. And many working parents do not have enough time to cook for the family. Can BPNI come up with recipes? Arun?
Yes, we have been coming out with recipes, especially for younger children, for complementary foods. But the genuine question is that if parents have time to do that at home. So that has to be, then this is a onus on the government actually to provide the time and financial resources to the working women, as maternity leave is given, as some other resources are provided to working parents, so that social security systems are such which take care of such time which is available. At the same time, people can think and discuss among the family, how do we actually minimize the use of ultra processed foods, if not completely eliminate them. Yes, over.
Thank you. I think we are rapidly running out of time, but few questions are important. Do you think we should continue for a little bit?
Mike.
I think we can take 5 more minutes.
Okay.
And people have to leave also. I see people are leaving also.
Okay.
So
Okay.
Yeah.
So a technical question by Ramachandran. While evaluating the ultra-processed foods as an exposure of interest in an epidemiological study, should the nutrient contents like calories be adjusted as a confounder, or does it get subsumed under the exposure? Maria? Has she left?
No, she's there.
She's
Yeah.
there.
You are on mute.
Okay, sorry. Good question. I think we can see it in like 2 ways. First, obviously, like nutrient content is one of the mechanisms that explain the association between ultra-processed foods and many diseases. But as I explained in my presentation, also many speakers told about it, it's not like this is not the only mechanism that explains this association. Otherwise, we could just like reformulate, as Phil said, and it would be okay. So we have like many other mechanisms that include like additives and like chemical components, and also the way they are promoted and the modes of eating related to ultra-processed foods. So the majority of these studies, they have presented like 2 models, one without the adjustment for nutrient content and one model adjusted for nutrient content. And like almost all studies, the association remains significant even after the adjustment of like saturated fat content, sugar content, total fat content. And in Kevin Hall's study, the randomized controlled trial by the NIH, they offered diets with no ultra-processed foods and with more than 80% of ultra-processed foods. And these diets were like paired for calorie content and also for the content of sugar, sodium, fiber, and fat. So the difference observed in the energy intake between groups remained even with a diet with the same nutritional content. So I think it's important to explore both types of analysis with and without adjustment.
Thank you. So, Professor Vinu said here is a question by government official, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Well, they are involved, at least some are attended. Dr. Sheila Dev. She asks, soy products are safe for intake after processing only as it is claimed because of anti-nutrients in soya bean. Is it a paradox for soya products regarding advice on ultra-processed foods or processed foods? Maria, would you like to say something?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is soy products are safe for intake of processing only?
They say, I think she's asking that soy products can only be consumed because they are believed to be safe only after processing. So, is it correct? Is it a paradox, or what would you recommend?
No, I think when we don't eat a lot of soy here in Brazil, and it's weird because we produce a lot. But if the soybeans are like treated with harmless or beneficial processing, I think it's the same of eating a rice, a white rice, or even a flour. That it's not harmful for our health. But we have now many soy products that are really ultra processed, like soy-based drinks and some like fake burgers made of soy, that they are really harmful, not only for health when we talk about like the risk of diseases, but they are really harmful for the society, for the economy, and they feed a system that is against family farmers. So I think soy is a really complex issue to discuss because it's inside a food system that's not so healthy when you think about environment and the workers. But still, if we eat like the bean, like if it were fava or another legume, it's not ultra processed.
Well, I think I will just take this last comment, a couple of comments, because we are running out of time, and I'm sorry for those whose questions I could not take. They could perhaps write directly to the presenters to whom the questions are directed. One is Nestle seems to be fond of Nutri-Score. So would you like to answer that, Phil? Or comment on the comment?
Yeah, so I saw that comment. It's a really good observation from who made that comment. So I guess, if you were the food industry, what type of approach to profiling the healthiness of foods would you want to be guiding policy? Would you want a food-based profiling approach that pretty much put most of your food products into the ultra-processed category? Or would you want a nutrient profiling approach, which allowed you to change the nutrient content, to change the algorithmic, score that you get, and therefore, essentially just change your product without being labeled ultra processed? So I think it's pretty obvious when you read beneath the lines why the food industry would prefer nutrient profiling. In many instances, we're seeing some of these front of pack labeling schemes based on nutrient profiling being used as a marketing opportunity. So, Milo with 4.5 stars, 4.5 out of 5 health stars, for example, we see that all the time. Apple juice, which is essentially just sugary drink, getting 5 out of 5 stars because it meets the nutrient criteria of these algorithms, where they're really, they're ultra processed foods.
Thank you. Here is this question by Hedy Lord. Are there any countries which are champions in regulating ultra processed foods in some way? Yes, I think Brazil is the pioneer, and this was highlighted in Maria's presentation along with the other countries. And finally, a comment by Patty before I end this question answer session. That's why Codex is so dangerous, and why IFPEN continues to watch this forum. It is all about extending the life of the product so it's ready for global trade. Agreed, Patty? Thanks. And with this, I think I end the question answer session. And the way forward is something which we might spend a few minutes on. And as far as I have got from this seminar and what it comes is, I think the recognition of this entity, ultra-processed foods, at least in the Indian context and perhaps the neighboring South Asian context, is pretty low. We need to educate or make people aware about it and link it to the health consequences. Then only the further actions to stem the potential damage caused by rampant marketing of these foods will decrease. Now, let us be also very sure that they are not, I would like to say that they are not really poison if we think it that way. I mean, occasionally I also enjoy drinking a Coke or something, but it's the issue of the quantity to which it is dealt. It's something like smoking or alcohol which is there, but definitely at the public health level, it is damaging, and we have to try to make all actions to stem the tide in some way. We are fortunately at the low end, and there is a lot of distance for the marketing agencies to cover. That's why everyone is coming in this region as far as the big food is concerned. To me, at this moment, I think the tangible actions are to educate the literate and the illiterate about what are the damages, something which NAPI has started doing, but it needs to be done on a much wider scale, to involve all the stakeholders, particularly the policy makers, whether they are interested in taking this beast head on or not, and the regulatory authorities like FSSAI, and there could be several actions. And the final action one could consider, India was a leader in this, whether something akin to IMS Act can be done, but it is a very, very long and a difficult route to follow. There are several interests as have been shown in the conflicts of interest. So with this, I think I will ask all my panelists to give us 2 or 3 priority actions that they consider would be important in this context, and then we can end the seminar. So can we start with Maria first in the order that they started? Just 2 or 3 priority, Maria.
2 or 3 what, sorry?
2 or 3 priority actions to stem this tide.
Oh, through actions to like.
Yeah. 2 or 3 priority actions which you think should be done.
I think like we have a major experience in Brazil regarding regulating school feeding. So our school feeding program is closely linked to the recommendations of our food guide. I think it's one of the most important actions that we could do to curb the rising of ultra processed foods, and also like to combine an actions that is taxation of ultra processed foods and at the same time the subsidies to minimally processed foods.
Okay. Arun?
Yeah, I think to take a very quick view, I would suggest having a legal framework to ban the promotion of ultra processed foods, and educating people about ultra processed foods, how to identify them and reduce their consumption. These are 2 things which I would suggest.
JP?
Yeah, I think I will go for some global legal or some policy making, just like we have an international code of marketing for BMS. I think something like that should be thought about, and then WHO can take a lead, and there should be a World Health Assembly resolution on this, having some regulatory document available to us, and countries can take examples from there and then develop their own legislation at national level.
Thank you, JP. And now for the big picture from Phil.
Thank you. So I would say, first of all, incorporate food-based profiling into your country's dietary guidelines. So that would be, for example, using some kind of classification schema like NOVA, and very deliberately putting that into the dietary guidelines, which can be used in combination with nutrient-based profiling to guide policy action in the country, which is exactly what Brazil's done and is doing. And Maria just mentioned the school-based feeding legislation that includes both in that legislation. So it can be done, it is being done. So that'd be number 1. Number 2 would be that if we are to stop the rise, halt the rise in consumption and draw down consumption, we really need to tackle this issue of marketing. Marketing is the key to unlocking this whole problem. If we can tackle the marketing through legislative restrictions, and marketing is a diverse, diversity of techniques used in marketing, we can really get some traction going, especially marketing to children as the most vulnerable group in our society. Number 3 would be to mobilize and maintain civil society mobilization around these foods. These foods proliferate where big food has power and control over policy and decision making. The antidote to the power of big food is the power of civil society resistance. And so that has to be also a really core pillar for action. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. So this has been really an excellent and an educative exercise, with leaving us with a hope for action to protect human health. And with this, now I bring it to an end and hand over to the organizers for any announcements or comments. Abhilasha.
Thank you so very much, Dr. HPS Sachdev. It was, I think today's session was deeply insightful, each and every one of it. I hope our panelists were able to address most of the questions put up by participants. And for the rest, you can write us an email at bpni.india@gmail.com with all your queries, and we shall get back to you. For all our participants, you can check our latest document on ultra-processed foods on our BPNI website, www.bpni.org. Lastly, I would like to extend my gratitude to the chairperson and all our esteemed panelists for their time and knowledge sharing. My thanks and appreciation to all of these panelists. I really cannot thank enough. It was such a perspicacious presentations that you gave today. And my thanks and appreciation to all the participants who gave their valuable time to this webinar. Thanks to the whole team of NAPI and DPNI for organizing this webinar again. And thanks to our collaborators from the University of Sao Paulo and Deakin University for collaborating. Thank you, Yashika, for providing the backend support from DPNI. And all of you can keep tuned to our website at www.org for our upcoming webinars. It was a pleasure having you all here. And before we sign off, I would request you all if I can take a screenshot of this, of all the people present with us today.
Yeah. Yashika can come up too.
Yashika, do you want to come up?
Yeah.
You're waiting? Okay, let's take a screenshot.
Hello all.
Thank you, Yashika, for all the
It's
backend
okay.
support.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It was very knowledgeable session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And with
Thank
this,
you.
we formally end the session.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.